Hello and good afternoon, and it's really nice to be here. We would be discussing Borker's book on Madrasa, especially focusing on the um, girl child, or you can say young girl studying there. And we have two scholars, academics here with us, Professor Meenakshi Thapan and Professor Aparna Rayaprol, and I'll introduce them. And of course, Him will introduce her book to you, and then we'll have the discussion. And I'll be very happy if there are questions, because madrasas today, I mean, there's centers of learning or basic studies or um, schools in a way, but because of the political climate, you could say there's so much controversy, so many misconceptions, so many wrong notions, so many twisted notions. So it's very important that we have questions. So scholars, academics will be able to answer them. There is box where you can leave your comments, and after we finish our discussion, informal conversation, in fact, then I'll be really happy if there are questions, and we love to answer them, so that some of the misconceptions, at least some of them, can be cleared about the madrasas. So I introduce the two. Him, of course, will speak about her book. She'll start with that, and then we have Professor Meenakshi Thapan with us, and Professor Aparna Rayaprol with us. And of course, though both of them really need no great introduction, they're very well known academics and scholars, but I'll just give a little brief introduction to both of them. Professor Meenakshi Thapan is Director, Rishi Valley Education Center. And before that, she recently retired as a professor of sociology and director, Delhi School of Economics. And she's done a lot of work in this field. And of course, she'll speak about her work, about her views and viewpoints when we open this for discussion. And we have Dr. Aparna Rayaprol, is a professor at the Department of Sociology, University of Hyderabad. And she was earlier head of the department, and she's author of this book called Negotiating Identities, Women in the Indian Diaspora. And she's done a lot of work related to gender studies. So I think we'll start with Borker to talk about her book, and then we start. It's more of a conversation, or you can say informal discussion on the madrasas. So Haim, I think first you start.
Yeah. Thank you to everyone who joined us. Thank you to the panelists. This is so encouraging to have an engaged discussion on something that you worked hard as a part of your doctoral thesis for all these years. My book, Madrasas and the Making of Islamic Womanhood, it basically looks at everyday life, the daily routine, the daily life in a girl's madrasa. As I said, it draws on my doctoral thesis at Oxford, and the question that kind of led to the book in a way was that what is the relationship between madrasa education, Islamic gendered ideals, and everyday experiences of these young Muslim girls who are studying in madrasas. The core of this book stems from my fieldwork in Madrasa Jamia Millia, which is a pseudonym that I have used, where I spent almost a year teaching English to the girls, to some of the teachers. I also visited a range of girls' madrasas belonging to a range of different denominations in Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, Bihar, and Jharkhand. And following that, because my work looked at the educational journeys of these young girls from their home to the madrasa and beyond, I also traced their academic and educational journey to universities following their madrasa education. So just so that you get a sense of my own journey, I am going to begin with, my own first day, my field notes from my first day in the madrasa. I waited in the hallway, the reception area at the entrance of the madrasa. My eyes followed the movements of a short old man bent over his back who'd just introduced to me as Chacha by the president. He had been instructed to take me to the girls' madrasa. I was very, very relieved that after 3 months of endless negotiations, finally I'd gained ongoing access. As we reached the end of the hallway, I saw Chacha opening like a set of keys. And I was a little surprised. I was like, maybe he thinks I'm a guest and he's opening the guest room. But he didn't say anything. And to my utter surprise, the little door didn't open into a room, but into a long, empty hallway. And I was greeted by one of the girls who looked very young, but said that she was a teacher and asked me to follow her. And I was really surprised that this was a place with 600 to 800 girls, and I couldn't see a single one of them. And I kind of, I was feeling a little uneasy, and I followed Rukaya. And then she suddenly started scampering down the stairs, and I kind of rushed to keep pace. We were met by two ladies who asked me, do I have a mobile phone? Do I have any laptop? Do I have any, cassette recorder or something like that? And I said no. And I was allowed to pass because I was, Rukaya said she's the president's guest. And I followed her into a narrow alleyway with uncovered drains and unfinished brick walls. And at the end, there was a stark gray building with 3 floors. And when I opened the door, there was like this place teeming with colorful salwar kameez and the girls, wishing me and greeting me. And I was like, oh, this is the madrasa. And so that was my first day. I'm going to, so that you get a sense, a sort of flavor of my book. And I'm going to also take you through a small portrait of one of the girls so that you can meet one of them through me. So this is Nikhat. I'm going to the university Appy because, they generally call me Appy because I was old, but not that old. So Nikhat's excited voice reverberated through my phone. I had first met Nikhat as a student of class 5 during my preliminary fieldwork in Madrasa Jamia Millia in 2012. She was 20 years old then and introduced to me as a model student who spoke fluent Urdu and English and sang beautifully. In appearance, Nikhat conformed to all the ideals of a madrasa student. Her thick back hair were like plaited. Not a strand of hair was visible below her white dupatta. Her coal-line eyes were cast downwards, and her hands and feet were very still, just visible below her, salwar kameez. When I returned to the madrasa at the end of the year, Nikhat had been appointed as a teacher. She had joined the Madrasa in 2007. The 15-year-old Nikhat had just finished class 10th from a private English medium school in a small town in Rajasthan when her father, uneasy about his daughter's obliviousness to Muslim culture, decided to shift her from the neighborhood village school to a girls' Madrasa in Delhi. Nikhat wrote the Madrasa admission test at her father's behest. Over time, she grew to like the Madrasa. She felt she learned how to live the right way. Her status as an alima, a learned religious scholar of Islam, won her much respect from her parents, relatives, and neighbors each time she returned during vacations. Interacting with other girls in the madrasa and hearing the examples of madrasa alumni studying at the nearby university, Jamia Millia Islamia, Nikhat realized that after her madrasa education, she could go to university too. When I last met her, she joined her second year of BA Honours in Urdu at the university. Nikhat's journey from a village school to a prominent university in Delhi exemplifies the important role that madrasa education plays, something that we often overlook. To capture this unfolding of young lives, my book focuses on 3 junctures. The first juncture is the girls' transition from their natal home in villages and small towns across India, mostly North India, to a residential girls' madrasa in Delhi. The second is how their own aspirations, their dreams, how they kind of find themselves in the madrasa through the 5 years. This is in spite of the fact that madrasas, as a part of their rules and regulations, encourage girls to largely restrict themselves to religious activities and family life. And the third juncture, which I study by looking at the transition made by some students like Nikhat from the closely scrutinized life to, in the madrasa to university. So I look at their aspirations by looking at this transition. I explain the first transition of the girls from their native homes to the madrasa by focusing on the imaginaries of gender and community that underpin the parents' educational choices and also the educational regime in the madrasa. Parents who I often spoke to when they came for the mulaqat, which happened on Fridays in the madrasa, when I asked them that how come you sent your daughters here, they would always call the madrasa that ye sahi school tha, ye hamari ladkiyon ke liye bilkul theek school tha. So there was always the term school that was used, and never like a madrasa in that sense. It was a place where the girls could avail dini talim, religious education, and dunyavi talim, the worldly sphere. They could learn about how to study the science and maths and English of the world. Marriage was a big question that, a madrasa educated alima was, almost like a certainty of a respectable marriage. The moral anchoring that the madrasa gave in these modern dangerous times where the girls were like, there was a danger of moral corruption. It was not co-educational. There was parda. So, it was a decent, secure, mehfooz jagah hai, and an extension of the family when it came to safety and security. The girls' madrasas on their part understand this demand, this need for, this sort of multifaceted education. And they provide this very consumable package, so you see that in the brochures, not just in the madrasa that I worked, but all the madrasas that I kind of visited, where, what the community was demanding in terms of how a pious Muslim girl should be it was almost like the madrasa was providing this consumable package tailored to these needs. This was inscribed in every aspect of madrasa education. So the physical architecture, very close spaces, like in North India, we're very familiar in, a lot of villages where we see the division, the spatial segregation, even in households of, the private and the public, like, the zinana and the mardana. And in the madrasa, it was very literal, very absolute, with very strict boundaries, with layers of security, constant surveillance. And the notion of safety didn't just extend to physical safety. Parda was encouraged to avoid the potential male gaze, but there was also an understanding that protection means protecting the girls from corrupting influences, corrupting from everything that would make them, detract them from the path of piety, from becoming these good, virtuous girls. And that included watching TV, music, mobile phones, movies, internet. So like a very interesting thing was that the madrasa had this very fancy computer lab and with a lot of computers. And then whenever I would see the classes, there was always like, what are the parts of a computer? This is the CPU, this is like the brain. And then I would ask them that, like when we had to download some forms, that what about the internet? And there was just no internet. And this sort of isolation, this sort of surveillance, this sort of security was explained and advertised in the brochures as facilities and arrangements that were provided by the madrasa, and also as something that the madrasas often talked about in any conversation with, say, for example, as a visitor, as a keen visitor or an interested stranger. When I come and I ask them that, so what is it? What are the facilities that they offer? Why is there a demand for, your institution? And they would be like, we're very different from the schools. We have a lot of stress on ensuring the safety of the girls. And this was reflected in the institutional routines, where there was a respect for authority that was taught. There was also teaching of duties. And I think what was most conspicuous, like something that was so obvious, was like just the bodily practices, the way gender was embodied. And, in terms of, how one dresses, how one conducts oneself, how one carries oneself. Scholars who have worked on madrasas in the Indian subcontinent often look at this disciplinary regime and employ Foucault's model, saying that this represents a total institution, where social power is exercised, giving the comparisons with Bentham's panopticon view. And there's a lot of literature which looks at boys' madrasas and girls' madrasas. It's instilling this sort of docility and disciplining. What I argue in my work is that while it's very tempting, and I mean that's what meets the eye, if one goes a little deeper, one realizes that there's a lot more that's happening inside. Because what it requires us to do is pay very careful attention to the everyday practices, to how the girls spend their time, to how they study, how they play. Where is it that they go when they want recreation? What are the little things that they do? So for that brings me to my second juncture, and that's like the main focus of my study, where I look at what are the everyday practices, and I cite my observations where I talk about that, yes, the girls are firmly espousing and in a way embodying the madrasa ideals, but this actually coexists with practices that often lie outside madrasa prescriptions. And I draw on feminist and anthropological research that emphasizes Muslim women's pious submission as an expression of agency, as a means of pious self-fashioning. And some of these things are very difficult to read. So I remember reading Sabah Mahmood and I was like, my God. But then I saw this beautiful example which she gave and I just got it. I got what she was saying and I felt that this is what I was seeing in the Madrasa. And she gives this example of a pianist. And she says that, a person learning a piano, and, learning how to move his fingers and produce a rhythm and a music, if he or she subjects themselves to a certain regimen, disciplining, is it not agential? And I think that's the question that I begin with. And that's what I take off from Sabah Mahmood. And I cite a lot of practices in my book where the girls often play games. They cite examples. They, just like we say in Hindi, you can often find girls chhaje pe latakti hain ladkiyan, bahar dekhti hain, and the teachers are telling them, no, move off from here. This is not right. And they're like, no one can see us. We're not breaching parda. The friendship groups, which conspicuously you always see them training the girls, training the younger girls. Ab tumhara baal yahan se nikla hai, seedha chalo, net ki chunni kyun pehni hui hai. And the same girls are helping these girls smuggle in the phones, there are shairi competitions, they're preparing for skits. So in many ways, it was like, almost like reminiscent of a hostel. And at some times this is not very discreet. So I'll read out something that one of the girls, Shama, said to me. She said, initially, I used to think of this madrasa as a jail. One could not go out, one could not talk outside, including to my own family. One could not keep a mobile. You cannot even peep out of the madrasa terrace. If they see you from downstairs, they shout at you. But now I think this is all for my own safety. Anyways, for a Muslim, life is like a jail. And if we bear this suffering, we will be rewarded in heaven in our afterlife. For a non-believer, this life is like a feast. But then he or she will suffer in the afterlife. But you know what, Appa? Some girls cannot bear such suffering. And it was these latter kind of girls, which actually, which is where you could see like these little things coalescing and coming together. Like, for example, in the farewell ceremony. So, you could see the girls walking in perfect, in this perfect fashion. And the moment they crossed a certain point in the full view of the teachers and the full view of the staff, the parents who were in the assembly, they, took out this confetti and, splashing and playing around. And and they thought that that's fine, that this is what being a madrasa student meant to them. Or, for example, they used the vocabulary that they learned in the madrasa of the shaitan and the jinns who would, because often like when they would go to the toilet and, the teachers would tell them, ki tumne apni dua padhi hai, because, that's how you're taught, when you're eating, when you're sitting, and the thing was that if you don't read your dua, then, the shaitan will come and he'll detract you from the pious path. And there was a lot of sort of general agreement on this. So if the girls would complain that, it's very cold and we're feeling very cold because there were no beds, the classrooms used to get transformed into the rooms, the gaddas would come down and they would become rooms. And the girls would say, it's very cold in winters. And if there were little cracks, and they would tell their parents that, we're not very comfortable. Can we come home for the winters? And the parents would be like literally competing with each other, saying that, no, I mean, this is like, somebody trying to detract you. You're on a pious path and you need to brave this. So for girls in this sort of a situation, like saying if something was not okay or why this was not happening was very difficult. And I saw a lot of them, use this vocabulary, appropriate this pious vocabulary, of like these jinns, and then, it just allowed them to be, just transport them to themselves to an alternate space. They could just be what they wanted. They were, they would dance. And I just saw 2 instances like that. But when I talked to the girls, they said it was rather common. And then it was like the onus on the madrasa and the parents to take them away. So the same parents who were saying you need to brave this were now saying, no, we need to get our daughter, we need to cure her. And this was their out. So this was not like these girls who were just like this, completely cast downwards, accepting, docile. These were girls who were thinking, enjoying, just growing up. What I argue is that these practices, this is not to kind of idolize it or magnify this. This is not to say there's no discipline. This is not to say there's no belief. Yes, there is, but it coexists with these practices that we see as a part of our own lives. And the embodiment of these practices allows madrasa students to tactically use madrasa education to create wider space for themselves without challenging the norms. I did not see a lot of evidence of girls reading scriptures and saying that, this is allowed in Islam. But what I did see was them using the vocabulary, them saying, the confidence, the voice that they were getting from this sort of an education, to open up, to negotiate for something more. Whether it was just remaining in school, whether it was applying to a university, whether it was giving an open school exam, whether it was saying that I want to wait a little longer to get married because my, a little longer after my elder sister is married because my dini khidmat kar rahi hu, and that was the currency. And I talk about this ambiguity as, what underpins the fashioning of gender in the madrasa, by saying that it was not something that was given and watertight, like the madrasa rules, but a fragile form of continuous day-to-day self-suggestion. And I traced the journeys of these students into Jamia, where I interviewed around 20 to 30 girls who had come from madrasas all across different parts of India. Initially, I tried to trace the girls from Jamiatul Mominat, some who married, some who did dawa, some who went on to, do higher studies, but I couldn't. I couldn't gain the sort of access. I couldn't maintain that sort of continuous communication because of families, because of distance, because of a lot of factors. So I eventually sort of traced it backwards. I looked at, the educational journeys into a high university which recognizes madrasa degrees and worked backwards. And I realized that some of the things which were subtle, some of the things which were, could be heard in whispers were magnified. So when I asked the girls in the madrasa, what do you want to do? And all of them would say, hey, we want to become a madrasa teacher, hame apna chota sa madrasa kholna hai gaon mein, and things like that. But when I went to the university, they were asking questions. They were asking things like, कि हमें मदरसा से बहुत अच्छी तालीम मिली है, बट हम बाकी लड़कियों को देखते हैं तो हमें लगता है कि हम अकेले जाके मेट्रो का टिकट क्यों नहीं ले सकते, हम झुंझुना क्यों जाते हैं, हमें आंसर आता है क्लास में तो भी हम बोल क्यों नहीं पाते. So, those sort of questions of what they want to become, that, they can give the NET exam in Islamic studies and become teachers. And I think that and I wanted to document and kind of capture that aspect of these sort of educational journeys, which unfold in different ways for different people. And I argue that this attention to this fluidity helps us to understand how girls are fashioning their own definitions of what it means to be a Muslim woman. Not by contesting madrasa norms or breaking away from the family and community ideals, but by introducing and including new ways of being into this vocabulary. And this process becomes more apparent. I've summed it up. I'm sorry, I've taken a lot of time.
It's been about 25 minutes, so anyway, good, very good hearing you. I have reviewed Haim's book. So what I really liked about the book was that she went into the madrasa. It was not that she was sitting somewhere in some office or research center and writing the book. She was there. She interacted with the children, young girls, and that I found was really genuine. That was like, you knew what's happening. And I am going to madrasas because I want to. I'm not expert in madrasas. I'm a journalist, writer, columnist, whatever. But I love going to madrasas the day I have time because I like to interact those little. I go to 3-4 madrasas where they're little boys. And I feel very sorry for them. They're cut off from their parents. Although they're well fed, well looked after, I go without announcing, and I always see them either reading the Quran or the other religious scriptures. They're well looked after, but they live with the basics. 1 or 2 madrasas, I thought I've entered a Gandhian institution. There was nothing except their cotton clothes, maybe some water somewhere, maybe the dal roti being cooked, and no telephone, of course, impossible, no mobiles, no transistors, no radios, no newspapers, and little children. And I think the parents feel that They would get 2 square meals and a safe thing. And other reason that got me really curious, I mean, I'm visiting madrasas from I think 20 years. Wherever I go, any city, I do visit the madrasa. Is that I know 3, 4 people who've done well in life. I mean, they have studied all through in a madrasa. One is a well-known lawyer of Delhi, Shamshad. One is the editor, publisher of Milli Gazette. He studied in a madrasa, then he went to Manchester to do his doctorate. And one is a professor in Jamia. So, I mean, they've done well and they good values, I feel. And so, I mean, I wouldn't say more now. If there are any questions, I'll answer. I'll request Professor Meenakshi Thapan to just give a brief sort of thing, what your views, please.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Am I on? I'd like to first of all congratulate Dr. Haim Borker for this fabulous book. And why do I say it's fabulous? I say it's because it seeks to break boundaries. And these boundaries are of more than one kind. It takes Islamic womanhood out of the box of tradition, of convention, victimhood. And it also attempts to unravel the complex and multi layered lives of young Muslim women. It therefore also shows us that madrasas for Muslim women need not necessarily be how they are as imagined. That is, that they are not only about conventional religious training and not much else. Being an anthropologist or sociologist, I might add that the method that Haim uses is what also appeals to me. She is not a member of the community of young women, yet she becomes an insider, so to speak, through sheer persistence, ingenuity, and also hard work. She gains access to the madrasa where she does her field work in the usual way, involved observation, deep interviews, despite what she calls awaz ka parda, that is, there is a parda on the voice, and sustained presence in different aspects of the madrasa's functioning. So this helps her to actually present a very vivid account of all that goes on in the madrasa, as well as in the young women's minds as they pursue their dreams and aspirations. Now, in her work, Haim questions the Islamic imaginary of who is this ideal Muslim woman, and she seeks instead to focus on what girls make of the madrasa education and thereby of Islamic womanhood. So it's not that what the madrasas are doing necessarily to them, but what do they make sense of? So concentrating on practice, I think, is central to her analysis. And in this way, she's actually looking at the daily lives of these young girls with new eyes and seeing agency in everyday acts of engaging with norms. And here I'd like to add that it's not only resistance that matters, but also how norms are met, how are they negotiated, and above all, how are they lived out. That such an approach that focuses on lived experience that Haim does is actually able to untangle women's capacity to aspire that she talks about. So, in other words, as I've already said, agency is at the heart of this exceptional book. She's looking at agency as practice, as lived experience, and this leads to an understanding that dwells on the gaps, the gray areas, the shadows that are evident in women's lives, which as they live out their lives. So the movement between aspirations and lived experience is actually a constant interaction in this work. She keeps referring to the girls' efforts to fashion themselves, to quote her, as pious subjects, and how there is an interplay between changing individual lives and transformations in the larger social landscape, which is marked by political and economic uncertainty. So her perspective, which focuses on micro perspective, is also influenced by the macro. And I found the use of ethnographic portraits absolutely excellent because she, through the very deft use of these portraits, she is able to address the relationship between madrasa education and the girls' own goals and their pious experience. Now, her focus is on the everyday, What is the everyday? How, when the school is over, the formal time, the classroom converts into a dormitory, the mattresses come down, the girls are laughing, engaging in banter, and the space of formal learning is lifted. Its absence is as revealing as is the space of the sheltered freedom that allows a restrained independence within its walls. And I think what it's important to understand, as Haim points out, is the parents value this aspect of the madrasa most in the aspirations to send their daughters out of home. What is that? That is this restrained independence. And this is how they treat their daughters within the family. So, as Haim tells us, that it's important to understand that the madrasa is viewed as an extension of the family. And that is why they take the decision to actually send the girls there. So, there is a kind of security that fulfills familial aspirations without contravening them in any way. But in addition to that, that's not all, because the madrasa does provide religious education that is, valued beyond all other knowledge in the quest to be a good Muslim. It is also with some disappointment, actually, that I further understood that parents primarily send their daughters to madrasas to improve the marriage prospects. And as she concludes, as Haim concludes, the Muslim woman is the moral repository of the community's identity. Now, this then leads to what she just talked about, this rigorous disciplining. And actually, what I liked so much in her work is that she dismantles Foucault's perspective through her understanding of everyday agential practices in the madrasa. I think the descriptions of the girls' ingenuity of actually crossing to the other side, if I may say, sidestepping norms, beating the system, are very celebratory moments in the book. She describes how girls get together in pairs, small groups, practice what she referred to as chajje pe latakna, gazing out of the jali or lattice work, through which they can see the street and beyond, the river beyond it. They're simply doing nothing, as she says. It is an act which actually has deep symbolic value, this doing nothing. It's not simply time pass, as other sociologists refer to, but it is, the value is to going to the terrace, for example, to dry clothes, but actually using the time and space to do other things, to be themselves, to hang out, to play badminton. And in a sense, I particularly like this story about the jinns, right? How the girls fake this possession, that they are possessed by jinn, so that they can leave the madrasa with their parents, ki jinnat ka asar na ho, that they need to be shown to a doctor or whatever, and they need to be cured of that. And this is the paradox that resistance is. I think we need to understand that resistance is not simply articulated in a voice that is other than that which is happening to the girls. Resistance actually takes place in the language and the discourse of reproduction. That is, the way in which they are being socialized is the manner in which through which they then seek to resist that socialization. So socialization is not a one-way street, which is what many psychologists make us understand, that it is, being socialized into the family. You learn the norms and practices and social ways of being. It actually is through the play of norms and expectations on one side and the subject's lived experience on the other that we need to make sense of what it means to be a young Muslim woman in a circumscribed space that seeks to constrain and yet within which they must find their space and freedom. So I think Haim really walks the tightrope. It's like, it's a dilemma of questions that are significant to understanding girls' practices in context of Dini Talim and Dunyavi Talim. And she portrays with sensitivity the vexed and paradoxical nature of madrasa education. Now, I have two brief comments which at some point during the discussion perhaps Haim might like to address. One is the aspirational horizons of these young girls are somewhat limited, I found. When they go to university, you have a chapter, very nice chapter about their life in Jamia Millia, and they are restricted to studying either Arabic or Islamic studies. So what happens to other subjects? They don't seem to have access into science or history and so on. And is this flowing? Because they do aspire university education, they aspire for that. But at the same time, while they're in the madrasa, they look down on schools and on girls in schools as being shameless and immodest and so on. I found that most interesting and fascinating. That is, they have this view of the madrasa as being the place where you learn adab and good tamiz and everything that is cultured and that is of goodness. But this, what happens then, is this linked therefore to their lack of interest in other things, so that when they go to university, they actually in a way not privileged enough to study other subjects, but actually get locked into Arabic or in Islamic studies. The other point that I would like to just briefly mention before I close is that when, as sociologists or anthropologists or educationists, we look to madrasas to understand Muslim women's aspirations, or indeed those of men, because this has also been the case. A lot of studies of Muslim education for the young has been through understanding the madrasas. Are we then not falling into a trap of looking at madrasas as symptomatic of Muslim children's education? That we are essentializing, in a sense, Muslim education and youth as well. Because there are other educational institutions which I have myself visited that are run by trusts which may be of a Muslim composition, as well as other private bodies. And do you think those institutions would actually foreground other aspects of the complexities and dilemmas that underlie the education of Muslim children and youth? Thank you so much. Thanks for a great book, Aim.
Thank you.
Now I invite Professor Aparna Rayaprol to give your comments.
Thank you very much, Humra ji. I completely agree with Professor Meenakshi Thapan that this has been a wonderful ethnography, and congratulations, Haim, and thank you for having me read this, journey into the spaces that are so difficult to access in contemporary times. For me, this book is at the intersections of migration, gender, class, and community. And in that sense, because the madrasa is a place where people have come from the village to the city, the nation's capital, albeit in a position of a cocoon and almost inaccessible ghetto. So it is, in one sense, a book that transcends binaries. It's a book that tries to look at reality between the sociologist's traditional ideal types. So I do see that a lot of these young women are sent to the madrasa in order to gain. By that, they are first generation learners in one sense, and being first generation learners, they are gaining access to something that their parents, often mothers, did not have, and that is Islamic education and that access to piety. So at one sense, it is a movement of upward mobility that is seen as that. But on the other hand, it is a very, very safe haven where the education that is imparted to them is education which is embedded in complexities of, piety, Islamic womanhood, chastity. I see this, and I see a fascinating comparison with colonial ideals of the Bhadra Mahila in one sense. What are these people learning? And Minakshi said, reproducing, and I would say they're reproducing at one level culture, not just religion or religious practice. The access to being a good Muslim was given only to the man. And here the gender binary is being transgressed and one is trying to access something that was there for men alone, but within their own spaces, where the boundaries of gender, the boundaries of public-private that you so beautifully brought out, Haim, both in the book and in your presentation earlier, I think those boundaries have not been crossed within the madrasa to many, to a great extent. So this kind of a morality, the Muslim morality or the Islamic morality that you're talking about, is an education that they will be expected to pass on to the next generation. And this is also going toward that practice of, needing to actually marry and probably beget children. That's the understated, overstated fact that they have to, deal with. So I would like also to dwell a little bit on the fact that they were trying to postpone marriage, at least a couple of them. And that's wonderful. If this results in the postponement of marriage, whether it's to university education. But I completely agree with Professor Thapan when she said that, what are they actually studying? And here, Haim, I would like to give you a vignette from my own experience when I walked into the Maulana Azad National Urdu University in Hyderabad, which is a neighboring institution of ours, to give a lecture on gender socialization. And it was a classroom of about 100 women wearing black burqas, as we call them in Hyderabad. So it was a picture. I didn't have a camera, I suppose, and I didn't have the sense, even if I had my phone, to take a picture. But it was a picture which was a stunning picture right in the heart of high-tech city. It's not a madrasa, it's an Urdu university. And there was a great emphasis on these women trying to make lives for themselves. And many of them are not middle class. You mentioned the word middle class, but I suspect some of the women in your study also come from poorer families. And here there is the problem, where, the burqa is actually a garment of presentation, because it's happy that they don't have to wear salwar kameez that can be presentable to the outside world because they just cannot afford it, So in that sense, these women were coming here, and what was their goal? It was not Islamic womanhood of the sense that you're talking about probably, but it was the goal of actually making a living. So they preferred vocational training to an MA in history or even a BA. So vocational training meant stitching, sewing, typing, and most importantly, translation. Urdu to English, English to Urdu was less probably easy, but they were trying to do that. So translation was something that they were doing. So I took that little digression just to give you a sense of the kind of ghettoized education that probably is still happening, where certain kinds of essentializations are continuing to happen. But then to continue the beyond binaries part, I would also try to emphasize the agential. The agential in this sense is, of course, the madrasa is the route to their outside world, and they themselves become teachers. And when they gain that access, that badminton that they play on the chat is absolutely wonderful, because that gives them the flight to freedom. And, so then my hope is that for the next generation, the mothers will be able to actually encourage that badminton. What I would have liked to see, and of course, it's not possible at the PhD, but definitely, Haim, in your future research, I think I would like to see a comparison with what is happening in the madrasas that are for young men. Is there some positive masculinity that we can look forward to? Some semblance of not only in the form of rhetoric, but is there an egalitarian gender, kind of idea? Does it mean quote unquote, allowing the wife to go to university? Why is there still that power hierarchy? So for their own daughters, will they be willing to change things? So these are very, very fascinating things, and I would like to see that as well. The other point that I would like to make is this is really a study of lived Islam, moving away from the text to the context, which we sociologists, of course, both of us here on the panel are biased in that side, and we love that kind of work. And I think it's also nicely reminds you of Islam observed in the Gyats in fashion. So I think there is a very, very interesting sense of the intersections, again, as I started, of gender, class, community, and of course, region. This is a context which is very, very North Indian, and being from Hyderabad, which is a city with several madrasas and very few. I was talking to a professor in Deccan Studies, and she was telling me that there are absolutely, very, very few madrasas for girls. And this is something, of course, they do have some. And I think this is a change that is, coming about in fashion. Is it fashionable to study? That's a word also that you use. And is it fashionable to study in a madrasa? What exactly happens in that? And when do these public-private issues begin to blend in? So the further the separation of the public and private, further is, the gendering and the hierarchies. So I see this as, in one sense, a feminist understanding of the women's ability to be able to fly out of that traditional nest, but keeping in mind their barriers and boundaries. So what are those gender barriers? And I hope to see those being crossed in the next generation. So yes, I think the last thing I would like to say is I would have also liked to get a sense of similar situations in other contexts where Muslim women do have this kind of religious education. And I did have a student who looked at, a reading of Islamic feminism and the way that Islamic feminists in the contemporary context have been engaging with issues of modern education. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Really good. Now we have only about 15 minutes left. So, and I'm getting a lot of questions, I just saw. So either Hail, you can answer briefly in 2-3 minutes what they have raised, some issues, but just take 2-3 minutes because there are about 25 questions. I'll just try to at least take 4-5 very relevant ones.
Or would it be? Oh, okay. So I'll. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much. No, this is most encouraging. But I understand a lot of some of the concerns that are raised. I do. This is something that I struggled with throughout my work. How do I see this? This sort of circumscribed aspiration. How do I see this? And it was very difficult for me to make sense of it, which is why I eventually relied on, in my struggle to, as a PhD scholar, to find a theoretical frame. I kind of opted for Appadurai because he kind of leaves it a little unsettled and up in the air, saying that the point at which you are, allows you to take a leap into, somewhere more. But you can only see from where you're standing. So from where we often stand, it's very difficult to imagine that world, right? But being a part of that world, I don't say that I could completely fit into the shoes, not at all. But I could see that point a little more closely, a little more closer. And that's something that I think I struggled with, and I think that that's a struggle that I bring out, when I talk about my own fieldwork research. And that's a struggle that I still, whether it come in terms of the dressing, in terms of the circumscribed aspirations, in terms of what Professor Thapan said, that their choices are limited to Islamic and Arabic studies, because that is the world that is known, that is the only option that can be exercised. And the thing is that a lot of these girls are not coming into the madrasa, I mean, willingly, in the sense of, where there's a, which is, I think, true for most of us who go, at 13 or 14, where we kind of go to the school that our parents opt for us. But then this is in many ways a school, but in many ways this is not. And obviously, the very fact that you've been to an institution like this limits your opportunities. But the aspect that I wanted to bring out was that part of that. This does not mean that the girls think of this, or happy with this cage. This is not a situation where the girls are saying, oh, this is all wonderful. Even though you find them hearing that, initially, you find them saying that this is what it is. And also, this is not to say that this is a cage at all. Because, the idea is of, it's not a compromise in terms of, finding fulfillment because you are in this situation, of reconciling. There was a genuine belief that this is our moral strength. And there is, I mean, for the year that I spent, for all the people I spoke to, I absolutely did not have it in me, with all the lens that I looked at, that this was a moral strength. And that's why Sabah Mahmood, and that's why what you have talked about in terms of that how it's lived, how it's negotiated, how you're okay with parts of it but not all of it. So I eventually decided to just lay it out bare and show, deal with the show of cards by saying that one doesn't know it all. And Aparna ma'am, your points, I mean, it gives me a lot of food for thought. I didn't look at it as a migration. I think that's because I was looking at it from a very different lens. So yeah, that gives me a lot of food for thought. The boundaries between private and public, but how they could not be crossed. Yes, that's something that I've not explored. And I think that that's something I need to. So where are we going from here? What does this mean for the next generation? I think definitely that's something one needs to think about. You're right. There are no answers. I did see incidents of the madrasa girls questioning, for example, that why is it that boys who come from madrasas into Jamia is okay for them to wear a, kurta and jeans? It's not un-Islamic. But because we are madrase wali, the nomenclature, ki hum madrase wali hain, so, it's not okay for us. So if we kind of, even, have the head cover, but we don't cover our face, so they're like, oh, whatever they learned in the madrasa, they've forgotten. Hawa lag gayi hai, So I did see them engaging in those sort of questions. But you're right. I mean, one doesn't know where it was leading to, where this questioning was leading.
Can we take the questions? There's no time. There only many questions. So I'll just take some. Then this will all come in the answers. Because I don't want to disappoint the listeners. There's this question from Dr. Saroj Kumari Prakash from Delhi. Are madrasas providing formal education?
So the entire thing is that yes and no. Madrasas are of various shades and kinds. This has been kind of elaborated in a range of contexts, particularly, I mean, something that brought it into public view was the Sachar Committee report. So, there's modernized madrasas, which have a madrasa board whose degrees are recognized, where they have a formal system of education, either of the state board with Islamic education. Then there are, maktabs where people go for learning, just recitation of the Quran, which are often clubbed with madrasas, which is actually a falsification. There are also madrasas which actually are affiliated with CBSE and ICSE, which are not recognized, but they as private institutions, almost like private schools, they have subjects called Urdu, which is actually not a religious subject, it's a language, but they have Urdu, they have Islamic studies, and they have a curriculum where, CBSE is taught. And you also have this institution, which which I'm kind of looking at now, which is of elite Islamic schools, where you have exactly the same combination, but they're actually recognized by things like the IB. So they actually follow that board. And
one more question.
Umbrella, sorry. And
One
then
more question, because there's no time. That after this wrap up, one more question I think is good from a lady called Sadia from Mumbai. I mean, there are many questions, but I'm just picking up this question for Dr. Borker. The institutions you visited attracted families of a particular social class. Could you comment on how prevalent the madrasa culture is among the upper middle class or the rich sections of the Muslim society? And if the goals of such madrasas are perhaps slightly different? Just 1 minute, just answer.
Yes, okay, very quickly. When the literature kind of tells us that the madrasa is the catchment, the catchment for the madrasa is extremely poor families, orphans, because this institution is highly subsidized. But what I actually found that for girls' education, and I think this is a clear gender angle here, and I think Aparna ma'am kind of hinted to that when she was saying that, women are now only allowed that access to becoming, that institutionalized religious education. So the thing is, I found that they were mostly low middle class, upwardly mobile families, where there was a certain section of surplus income that the family could afford, and hence they wanted to invest it in the girls' education, religious or otherwise. So I wouldn't say that this was the poorest of the poor section. So there was a section which was, like the just for yatim, like it repeatedly in the madrasa, yatim bache hain, the ones who were studying on charity. But that was just like 10 to 15% of the students. How did I find representation from the upper middle class sections? I surprisingly did. But the age gap was different. So these were girls who had finished their class 12th, and kind of, the families wanted them to be married. And this would then sort of emerge like as a grooming school, an add-on, something in addition to a school education, and their concerns were then this sort of presentation, this Islamic presentation, the Islamic vocabulary, and I guess access to respectable marriages, without the danger of the girls asking that, we want this.
We've got 10 more minutes, so that's like a bonus. So I'll just take one or two more questions maybe, because then I want your final comments. One is from this lady, I think from Calcutta. Just give me a minute.
Ma'am, can we also have questions to the panelists? Because that would be really nice.
Yeah, of course. I mean, really good because you people have been working in this field for years.
Yes.
So.
Yes.
This question is from a lady from Calcutta, yes, Sri Yashi. How would you compare the culture, the discipline imparted in madrasas with gendered disciplining followed in mainstream schools? Length of skirt, hairstyles, expressions of sensuality, etc.
Absolutely. I think thank you. I don't know you, but thank you for asking this question.
Some of the questions are very good, actually.
Yeah. I think that the one exercise that was very revelatory, and I thank my supervisors for this, because, I was coming at this from, they're not even allowed to touch their hair, their hands are not allowed to be visible, because coming from the kind of education I myself did. And, my supervisor said that, why don't you go to a government school there? Just go. I don't want any notes. I don't want anything back. Just go there and just tell me what you saw. And what I saw was, in the same area, the Sarvodaya girls' school that was there. It was a co-ed school, not the girls' school, and the classes were gender segregated, happening on different floors at different times. So it was co-educational, but it was gender segregated because that was the demand of the community. And I thought back to my own education. I thought back to some of the things that I read about convents, where we were always encouraged कि सीढ़ियों पे ऐसे ढम 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 करके नहीं चलना है. Walk like a lady, cross your legs, speak softly, don't be so boisterous. And I think that this, yes, the vocabulary was different, probably the extent, the degree, yes, but I think it's a similar idea, it's a similar core, and similar ideas about, in terms of being good wives, about how to please people, how to respect, how to be a good woman. And also like the thing about jinns, like, how we're always taught about these ghosts, about these people who transgressed and then, they're punished, and these girls and these stories. And I found that, though this was a little different, but, similar idioms similar expressions and similar smuggling in of things. So yes, a lot of similarities, but also differences in vocabulary, differences in degree, and difference. I think when religion comes into education, there is this, you are answerable for something more. And I think that's what I've not ever been able to decide in my own sense about religion and education. It's there, it's very conspicuous, it's very obvious, but what does it lead to? Because it almost just strengthens it, just adds that added layer of hold that you can't. Yeah.
I'm so happy that you went inside the madrasa and spent so many days so you could answer all this. Otherwise, it's all, bookish. And sure, this question is from. Sorry.
Ma'am, would the other panelists like to add to this, like especially
you are. We have got 10 minutes. That's all. Just one more question I'll take. Then you can your final comment. So 1 second. This one question is from. 1 second. Sharda Naik from New Delhi. Do the girls learn music? What kind of songs are acceptable to the madrasa discipline? So you can all.
So music is not taught, in the sense that if you actually see music, it's almost like the vocabulary of haram is almost kind of often used for music. But the girls sing these beautiful naats, these songs in the praise of the Prophet. And often it's like, as a visitor, like my first week went into listening to naats in English, in Arabic, in Urdu. And so this was like a part of the presentation of the model girl, in a way. So
Sheer and Shairi also you said earlier.
Yeah. Shero Shairi was a no-no. But this is what the girls did for their own fun. And that's when I saw a lot of the Bollywood songs being like kind of mutilated to be passed off as Shairi. So I definitely knew that this was being heard somewhere, this was being practiced, and this was being enjoyed. Similarly with the dancing also. And I would also like to add that while there was this sort of vocabulary of, this is how it should be, but in the madrasas, Republic Day function, Independence Day function, it was not just about how the girls were presented to, say, an individual stranger like me, but it was also like how the madrasa presented itself to the outside world, to the parents, to their chief constituency in a way, where the girls were encouraged to perform skits. And I remember this beautiful song that the girls devised on a naat, which I mentioned in my book, which was in the aftermath of the Nirbhaya gang rape case, where they said, "Kaum agar tum saath na do, to tanha humse kya hoga?" And they made this song to the rhythm of a naat, like a religious sort of a poetry, and they devised this and they made it themselves, and it was beautiful. Talking about. Yes, sorry.
One last question before we come with the final comments. It is sent by Mujibur Rahman, New Delhi. What is Awaz Ka Parda? Just explain.
Okay. Awaz Ka Parda is that the girls are encouraged that, in front of Naam Haram, men who are potential marriage partners, the girls shouldn't actually speak. In the madrasa, how this is practiced, because the madrasa education is actually a practice of real life, right? I mean, that's how it is. That's you being groomed in a way. So the idea is that you should not raise your voice, like the way you're not supposed to, like niche nigah se dekhna, So like same ऊंची आवाज में नहीं बोलना. So it's not like don't speak at all, but it's like ऊंची आवाज में नहीं बोलना. Speak softly, speak like a lady. Don't argue back. Don't have arguments for the sake of it. If you have questions, ask politely, or actually it's better if you don't have questions, but
now we come with the closing remarks. So Professor Aparna Rayaprol, what do your closing comments?
Well, I think one of the fascinating aspects for me, like I said, I started off with that comparison with that Bhadra Mahila and the cult of domesticity. So, where does this education come out of that private world coming into this public world of private world of family, public world of education, and then the education becomes the private world again. So we are constantly transgressing these boundaries. So are we able to move away from this kind of an ideological, a traditional gender ideology, to a more egalitarian one at an individual level? Okay, at an individual level, but how do we actually, contend with it at an institutional level? Can there be, I didn't see any attempts by teachers through your study to break institutional norms. If they are there, we should talk and reveal them a little more. Those, if they are not, are there are there continuities in perpetuation of patriarchies? Are there new kinds of patriarchies? These are the questions, dear. Thank you. Thank you very
Professor
much.
I just want to say something with reference to one of the questions, which was about gender identity and whether the curtailing of girls in other institutions. And I want to say that looking back at my own childhood, I was always being scolded for being very loud. And I remember when my school report came and said she is very argumentative, my father asked me, "Why do you argue? You should not be arguing. Don't answer back." And also laughing very loudly, that you laugh very loudly, it's not very ladylike. All these things are said, and these attempts at socializing are made with, I would say, not only young Muslim women in a madrasa. The point I'm trying to say is, let's not also look at madrasas as a kind of space which is hierarchical and patriarchal more than other spaces. Let's not sort of put it into a
Absolutely.
ghetto, into a ghettoized kind. I mean, we make it a ghetto, right? I don't want to do that. I want to, and what really charmed me about your work is the fact that we can see agency in everyday life. In my own case, for example, I didn't get sucked into that thing of always sitting with crossed legs and laughing quietly and being very, goody goody. So there is resilience in the human spirit. And that resilience is what we need to unmask and understand. And yes, I agree with Professor Aparna Rayaprol that the new forms, what are the new forms of patriarchy? Why is it that teachers didn't question? I would think that they didn't question simply because they were themselves socialized in a particular way. But at the same time, and also with the passage of time, I think children are much more fresh. They are not as conditioned as we are. So the capacity to respond to disciplining or to being being formed in a particular way, or of gender identities being reproduced in a particular way, is much greater when you're young. You can actually respond to it with, I think, as teachers, perhaps they've internalized it over the years and then lived their lives in consonance with what is the normative expectations, and therefore find it harder to in fact contest or even allow children to ask. But at the same time, you do mention that one or two teachers, that, if I'm not wrong, Ruqayyah's story, right, which is so powerful in many ways. So I think we have to look at it in a balanced way as to what is possible within an institutional setting which is so circumscribed, and yet not ghettoize it and see the girls as having agency within their limited space. Yes, okay. Maybe I also would like to add that perhaps we needed a psychologist also in this panel, who could have actually talked about the inner world and about how do girls identify with their identity, which is being into which they are being molded. How are they? Maybe when you have another discussion on your book somewhere else, you can think about that. So these are some of the things that I just like to add to whatever has gone before.
I think we'll end here, and I'm hoping that he would do another book on the boys' madrasas, because it would be an eye opener. It will break all those misconceptions, those dangerous notions that are being floated. And I'm really happy, because when I read her book for this review I had to do, I was taken aback by the genuine connect, that she wanted to connect with the girls before writing, which is rare in today's scenario at least. I'm really happy, and I just want to end a little thought that comes to my mind each time I visit a madrasa, that I wish there was vocational training on, because you can't have children just into religious thing, and what is the future is so bleak. And I blame my community for that, because every madrasa has a management, it has a chairperson there who looks after the thing, and there should be vocational training, whatever, there's tailoring, carpentry, anything, that the children can, some future for them. But I'm really happy we could have this discussion. And him, congratulations once again. I mean, you've done a fantastic job, and you were so genuine about the entire thing. That really touched me. So thank you so much. I think we end here. Really nice hearing you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
And thank you to you, ma'am. Thank you for moderating this.
No, I wanted to do it because your book was so good. I mean, so genuine, and it's rare in today's times. Anybody who's genuine, I'm there. I can give up my life if somebody is genuine. So I'm really happy for you. Next book on boys' madrasas. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.